Rasputin didn't just survive one murder attempt, he survived all of them. Poison slipped into his food, bullets tearing through his body, a beating that shattered bones, and finally chains around his limbs before being thrown under the frozen river. Each attempt should have ended him, yet somehow he lingered, crawling back into the story like death itself couldn't claim him. That's not just survival, that's something unnatural. And every failure to kill him only made him more powerful, more terrifying, more untouchable. Ministers begged for his downfall. Generals raged against him. Enemies plotted his death. But Rasputin stayed, because no matter how many tried to stop him, the royal family clung tighter. And the more power he gathered, the more unstoppable he became. December 1905. Russia's streets were on fire with protest, blood staining the snow. Inside the imperial walls, another flame burned quietly, one no soldier or minister could put out. Nicholas II was Russia's last Tsar, or emperor, and Alexandra was his deeply devoted but anxious empress. Together they weren't looking for more military men or political advisors. They were desperate for someone who could promise them hope, especially with their sickly heir clinging to life. Into that silence stepped Grigori Rasputin, a rough-hewn peasant from Siberia, broad-shouldered and unsettling, with a stare so intense it made people avert their eyes. The reason he was summoned was simple and terrible. The heir, Alexei Nikolaevich, was born in 1904 with haemophilia. Every fall, every bruise could open a flood the doctors could not stop. For Alexandra, the mother, the illness was a private ruin. She clung to anything that eased the shock of the boy's bleeding. In 1912, when Alexei nearly died in Spala, physicians wrote the worst in their notes. Alexandra, frantic, sent for Rasputin. He replied that the child would live. The doctors laughed, but within days Alexei improved in a way that baffled the doctors. The emperor and empress were so happy that they opened their family to him, and that was how Rasputin got into the royal house. It is one thing to slip inside the palace through a child's sick room. It is another to stay there, unchallenged, and weave yourself into the daily rhythm of the rulers. That was Rasputin's next trick. He did not knock at the grand doors or wait for ceremonies. He moved through side passages, past guards who learned to stop asking questions, and into the private orbit of Nicholas and Alexandra. In those walls, he was no longer just the mystic who prayed for a bleeding boy. He became a companion in solitude. Alexandra, often judged cold and distant in public, found in him someone who absorbed her confessions without ridicule. He soothed her guilt, reminded her that God had chosen her burden, and dared to advise her with a bluntness courtiers avoided. Slowly, the roles of comforter, spiritual guide and practical counselor bled together until the line between family matters and affairs of state blurred. When Nicholas took the disastrous step in 1915 of leaving Petrograd to command the army at the front, that private influence swelled into something larger. With the Tsar gone, Alexandra assumed greater weight in the running of the capital. She wrote him letters constantly, mixing reports of court intrigue with guidance she attributed to our friend. These notes touched on who should be trusted, who should be dismissed, and which men might betray. Through her hand, Rasputin's words reached Nicholas's command tent hundreds of miles away. Rasputin's judgments rode the ink of the Empress's pen, and in wartime, those judgments reshaped the very circle of ministers who steered the empire. Ministers rose and fell with a speed that made the government look unstable, and often the deciding factor was Alexandra's impression, shaped by Rasputin's whispers of loyalty or corruption. Men who wanted advancement noticed. They sought Rasputin not because of his learning or lineage, but because he had the Empress's ear. They offered favours, courted his blessing, and treated him as the key to imperial favour. He became a broker of influence, a man whose word could open doors or slam them shut. What began with prayers at a sickbed now touched the highest offices of the Russian state. The petitions never stopped. Bishops sought his nod for appointments. Relatives of the desperate begged for pardons. Provincial officials slipped requests for promotion into his hands. Even when results were mixed, the very act of pleading with him confirmed his centrality. Each petition reminded everyone that access to power flowed through the same channel that eased Alexandra's fears. And Rasputin, never shy of scribbling notes or leaning in with quiet endorsements, reinforced the belief that he was the one man who could decide the fate of ministers and generals. What made his hold so unusual was the way he connected worlds that were normally separate. His spiritual authority gave him steady access to the family's inner circle. The Empress's emotional dependence made that access feel permanent, and the chaos of war created openings where his private advice could slip straight into state decisions. He didn't command armies, yet generals watched him nervously, knowing that through Alexandra, his words could reach the supreme commander. He didn't sit in the Council of Ministers, yet they constantly weighed whether his favour or suspicion could shape their careers. Step by step, Rasputin's influence stacked up, cumulative and corrosive. The more Alexandra leaned on him for calm, the more he shaped the empire's leadership. She believed his prayers kept Alexei alive. She believed his counsel protected the throne. She believed that when he spoke, Providence itself was speaking. And when belief holds that deep, facts and logic stop mattering. But behind the stories and the fear, who was the real man? What kind of life could forge someone like Rasputin? Well, sit back and relax, because that is what we are about to answer. Grigori Rasputin's story doesn't begin in some glittering palace. It begins in Pokrovskoye, a small Siberian village where life was as rough and unpolished as the land itself. He was a peasant, the kind who worked the soil, prayed in the same wooden church as everyone else, and lived within the narrow routines of survival. He married young, had children, and on the surface looked like any other man tied to the rhythms of rural life. But people started noticing something odd about him. Whispers started following him. People said he had a gift, not the kind a scholar or a priest might have, because Rasputin wasn't ordained and had never been near a seminary. His gift seemed strange, powerful, and impossible to ignore. He prayed with a force that seemed to tear through the ordinary. He spoke with a conviction that felt less like preaching and more like revelation. That intensity earned him a new label, Starets, a wandering holy man. Now, Russia had plenty of so-called holy men roaming the countryside, but Rasputin wasn't just another drifter mumbling psalms on the roadside. He had a knack for convincing people he was closer to God than the priests in their gilded robes. Maybe it was his piercing eyes, maybe the simplicity of his words, maybe just the audacity of it all. Whatever it was, villagers started treating him less like a neighbour and more like a vessel of divine authority. He began travelling, drifting between monasteries and settlements, pulling in fragments of influence along the way. Monks who met him didn't see polished theology, but they couldn't ignore the sincerity burning out of him. And people, especially the desperate ones, trusted him. You can see the pattern, right? A man who had nothing but conviction ends up gathering something more powerful than money or land: followers. It didn't take long for Rasputin's reputation to leak out of Siberia. His name passed from mouth to mouth until it reached the ears of people far removed from peasant huts and muddy roads. He found patrons. First came Bishop Theophan of St. Petersburg, a man whose voice carried serious weight in the Orthodox Church. Theophan invited Rasputin to stay at his home and quickly became one of his key allies. Through the bishop, Rasputin gained access to important social gatherings, where he began to gather early followers. Theophan was reportedly completely carried away by him, seeing in Rasputin the ideal of a holy man. He esteemed him as a saint and spent time with him gladly, associating openly with someone who would soon become a figure at the center of Russia's most powerful circles. Then came two women who would change Rasputin's trajectory entirely: Grand Duchesses Militsa and Anastasia of Montenegro. They weren't just noble by title, they had the ear of the imperial family. And unlike most aristocrats, they welcomed mysticism and even leaned into it. Militsa and Anastasia, daughters of the King of Montenegro, introduced Rasputin to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra in 1905 and 1906. Both were prominent figures in the ruling dynasty, with connections to well-known church leaders. Militsa in particular, one of the so-called Black Sisters, was deeply immersed in occult practices and fervent in her belief in mysticism, which was fashionable among the Russian aristocracy at the time. The princesses recognized the potential in Rasputin's reputed healing powers and spiritual insight, and encouraged his presence at court, giving him a foothold in the heart of power. Suddenly, Rasputin wasn't just drifting through villages, he was stepping into St. Petersburg society. And that's where things get interesting, because when he arrived in the capital, he didn't come dressed as a priest. No cassock, no academic credentials to brandish. no polish to his words. He walked in exactly as he was, a layman with calloused hands and piercing certainty. The court was used to pomp, titles, and endless layers of ceremony. Rasputin sliced through all of that by simply not caring. He spoke plainly, prayed like every word might rip open heaven, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having learned to bow properly. You'd think all that would have disqualified him, but it did the opposite. His lack of refinement was the very thing that set him apart. To the noble elite, Rasputin felt authentic, and in an age when the Russian Empire itself was creaking under unrest, authenticity was in short supply. By the time Rasputin had secured his place near the throne, he wasn't just whispering prayers anymore, he was shaping policy, and he did it in a way no trained politician or seasoned courtier could match. He wrapped political advice in the clothing of prophecy. He spoke as if every personnel choice or state decision had been whispered into his ear by God himself. The Tsar and Tsarina, already fragile under the weight of war and personal tragedy, clung to his words as though they were lifelines. When Rasputin declared that a certain man was blessed or chosen, Alexandra repeated it with the certainty of scripture. If he described a name as dark or dangerous, the same warning travelled straight into the Tsar's letters at headquarters, disguised as divine revelation. That was how War Minister Vladimir Sukhomlinov, accused of corruption and catastrophic mismanagement, kept his post because Rasputin had reassured Alexandra that he was chosen. And when Interior Minister Alexei Khvostov dared to move against Rasputin, the mystic branded him dangerous, and soon Khvostov was gone. The same pattern played out with the premiership. Competent statesmen were dismissed as dark, while men like Boris Sturmer, widely despised as corrupt and inept, rose into positions of immense power because Rasputin had declared them acceptable. Even the most capable officials were not safe if Alexandra believed Rasputin disapproved. Alexei Polivanov had revitalized the Imperial Russian army, yet she wrote, "I don't like the choice of Minister of War Polivanov. Is he not our friend's enemy?" In her eyes, Rasputin's word could turn talent into liability. She repeated his verdicts word for word in letters to Nicholas, and the Tsar treated them not as opinions, but as divine instructions. In that environment, a polished resume mattered less than whether Rasputin's prayers had supposedly cleared your name. What made Rasputin dangerous wasn't only his closeness to the imperial couple, it was the way he blurred the line between faith and administration. Decisions that ministers should have argued over were instead resolved with the authority of a vision. And Rasputin never framed his words as options. He made them sound like commands from heaven, and in a court already consumed by anxiety over the Tsarevich's fragile health, who would dare challenge heaven? If you wanted to climb in government, you didn't just draft a policy memo. You sought a meeting in Rasputin's quarters, maybe through a confidant who could sneak your name into his ear. His staircase in Petrograd became a waiting room for the ambitious. Deputies, courtiers, even high-ranking officials queued for a moment of his attention. A single word from him could become a line in a note to the Empress, which then carried the weight of an order from the Tsar. All of this might have remained invisible, but his influence had a direct, visible effect. Instability at the top. What historians now call the ministerial leapfrog began. Prime ministers cycled through one after another. Alexander Trepov tried to hold the line against Rasputin's meddling, but was soon dismissed, replaced by Prince Nikolai Golitsyn, whose only real qualification was that he never resisted the court's wishes. The Interior Ministry was no less chaotic. So if it wasn't gas, and it wasn't lightning, attention turned inward, to the group itself. Could there have been a breakdown? Could panic alone destroy 7 people? Psychologists proposed that what occurred might have been a case of mass hysteria or acute panic disorder, triggered by one member's sudden collapse. In this scenario, the theory goes, Sasha Krysin, possibly suffering from undiagnosed altitude sickness or cardiac issues, collapsed violently. The sight of him bleeding and seizing triggered a domino effect: panic, confusion, and flight. Korovina, a woman of discipline and pressure, may have misread the moment, trying to enforce control instead of calming fears. Her shouting could have escalated the terror. The group, overwhelmed by shock, might have entered a shared psychotic state, disoriented, hallucinating, and in full physiological meltdown. The cold rain, the altitude, and the exhaustion could have pushed their bodies beyond the threshold. But mass hysteria does not usually result in death. Not like this. It doesn't cause pulmonary edema. It doesn't make you bleed from the eyes. It doesn't kill 6 people and spare the 7th. Valentina's story made clear that whatever killed her friends wasn't just psychological. She described physical symptoms, violent seizures, foaming, and discoloured skin. She didn't speak of madness. She spoke of a force that tore through them like a chemical fire, with no warning and no mercy. Still, the psychological theory persisted in some circles, not because it explained everything, but because it was one of the few explanations that didn't require accepting the impossible. Then came the quiet voices, the ones who looked not to science but to the secrets buried by governments. Some believed the group had accidentally wandered into a restricted area. Siberia is riddled with military installations, old Soviet research stations, and unmarked test zones. Maps are unreliable. Areas marked as hiking trails can abruptly border classified land. What if the group had triggered a buried sensor? What if they had stepped into a chemical or biological zone that had long been forgotten? There were rumours of nerve agents tested during the Cold War, weapons designed to paralyse rather than kill or to leave no trace. The symptoms Valentina described, seizing, foaming, panic, were eerily close to VX gas exposure. In such a case, contact with a contaminated object or plant could lead to rapid neurological collapse. Death within minutes. No scent, no colour, no warning. But this theory had its flaws too. Investigators found no trace of contamination, no chemicals, no tampering with the bodies. The area, though remote, was not marked as restricted. And again, why had Valentina survived entirely unaffected? Then came the most controversial theory of all. Some looked at the Korovina Group incident not as a standalone tragedy, but as a part of a pattern. You see, in 1959, just north of the Kamar Daban range, another group of hikers met a violent and unexplained end in the Ural Mountains. 9 bodies were found under bizarre conditions. Torn tents, internal injuries without external trauma, radiation, missing tongues, scattered corpses. The Dyatlov Pass incident. The similarities were uncanny. Both groups were experienced. Both perished under mysterious circumstances. Both showed signs of intense internal trauma, yet with no clear cause. Both left behind one survivor. In the years since, Dyatlov has become a subject of folklore, conspiracy, and obsession. Could the Korovina case be part of the same phenomenon? Some researchers quietly and cautiously suggested that both groups were exposed to a natural but undocumented geophysical event, perhaps infrasound. Infrasound is low-frequency sound beneath the threshold of human hearing. Under specific conditions, it can be generated by wind passing over mountain peaks, creating powerful waves that penetrate the body. Laboratory experiments have shown that infrasound can induce anxiety, unease, nausea, and even hallucinations. Theorists proposed that both the Dyatlov and Korovina groups might have experienced infrasound-related panic. Disoriented, sick, and terrified, their behaviour unravelled. They ran, collapsed, and died. The problem is, infrasound doesn't kill, it unsettles, it disturbs. But it does not cause bleeding from the mouth, seizures, or death within minutes. The symptoms didn't match. The theory couldn't stand alone. But over the years, other patterns began to emerge. In 1997, 4 hikers in the Altai Mountains, just a few hundred kilometers west, were found dead in their tents. Their bodies showed signs of trauma, but no outward wounds. 1 had a crushed chest. 2 had ruptured blood vessels in the eyes. The official cause was listed as exposure. But locals noted the date. Almost 4 years to the day since the Korovina incident. In 2001, a group of geologists reported that their instruments picked up strange readings, sudden magnetic surges, near the same ridge. The surges were too strong to be natural, but no equipment on Earth could have caused them. Not legally anyway. And in 2014, a satellite passed over the Kamar Daban range, registered an unusual heat signature. One that lasted only moments, but registered temperatures inconsistent with any natural phenomena in the area. Officials dismissed it as a glitch. By now, the Korovina case had taken on a new shape. It wasn't just an isolated tragedy, it was a node in a larger web, a breadcrumb in a trail of unexplained patterns that reached far beyond one ridge, one tent, or one girl running barefoot through the woods. The survivor Valentina never gave another interview. Some say she moved to Belarus. Others claim she returned to Irkutsk and changed her name. To this day, no one knows for sure where she is or whether she ever hiked again. And just like we started, we ended confused. Fade to black for 3 seconds. Valentina never publicly commented on these theories. She spoke to investigators. She confirmed the timeline, described the symptoms, and identified the bodies. Then she left. Perhaps she knew what happened, or perhaps she knew that knowing wouldn't matter, that people would twist her memory to fit their own narrative. Those who worked on the case never quite moved on. For them, it was more than a mystery. It was a haunting. Some of the search and rescue team members who recovered the bodies reportedly refused to speak about the scene. One man, who remained anonymous, told a local paper years later that what he saw in the clearing didn't belong to this world. He refused to elaborate. Another investigator, when asked if the deaths could be explained by natural causes, simply said, "Not all things can be explained." The area around the site has become a kind of unspoken taboo. Local hikers avoid it. Even experienced guides steer clear. They don't talk about it openly, but they don't go there either. As time passed, the story faded from public memory. By 1990, Russia was in turmoil, politically, economically, and socially. News moved quickly. People were exhausted. Another mountain tragedy, tragic though it was, didn't make international headlines. Not like Dyatlov. But those who remember know that something happened in the Kamar Daban that defies logic. It wasn't panic, it wasn't poison. It wasn't a storm or a predator, it was something else. In the years that followed, bits of information resurfaced. Re-examinations, late interviews, autopsy report fragments leaked online. The puzzle remained unsolved, but the pieces continued to shift. One such piece emerged from the mouth of an ex-military official who claimed the area near the Korovina Group's route had been involved in Soviet-era weapons testing. Not missiles or landmines, but psychological operations, acoustic weapons, directed energy fields. Devices designed not to kill outright, but to disorient, manipulate and induce fear in enemy combatants. The kind of tech meant to make soldiers turn on each other without knowing why. He said the research had been scrapped, but the field sites remained. Forgotten, unmanned and highly unstable. His claim was never substantiated, but it struck a nerve. The symptoms matched. Convulsions, vomiting, paranoia, and aggression. Sudden breakdown of group cohesion. It sounded like a weapon engineered not just to cause death, but madness. If that technology existed, it would explain why no official conclusions were ever reached, why the investigation closed so quickly, why files went missing, and why Valentina disappeared from public view, but there was no physical evidence, no machine, no radiation, no disturbed ground. Just bodies and a story too strange to process. And so attention returned, quietly, almost reluctantly, to something older, less scientific, more primal. Some Siberian locals, particularly the indigenous Buryat people, believed that the mountains in question were sacred and dangerous, places where spirits lingered, where humans were not welcome. The Kamar Daban range, in their tradition, was not simply terrain. It was a boundary, a place where the material and the spiritual bled into one another, a threshold, and sometimes people crossed it. There were tales centuries old of hunters who vanished under clear skies, of entire nomadic families found frozen in unnatural positions, mouths open, eyes wide, skin strangely marked. These were not metaphors, these were stories passed down in hushed tones, not to entertain, but to remember. When locals heard about the Korovina group, they weren't surprised. The symptoms, madness, bleeding, silence, matched what their grandfathers had warned about. They didn't call it an accident, they called it trespass. They said there are places you don't sleep, places where the wind doesn't blow but the trees still move, places where, if you listen closely, the mountain speaks back. Sometimes it just watches, other times it takes. This wasn't the kind of thing that made it into police reports, but it was the kind of thing people listened to, even if they pretended not to. In 2012, nearly 2 decades after the incident, a hiker by the name of Igor Lobov retraced the Korovina group's last known route. He wasn't an investigator or a conspiracy theorist, just a former soldier, curious about the story, haunted by what he'd heard as a boy. He carried a camera, a journal, and 3 weeks' worth of supplies. His plan was simple: reach the site, document the terrain, and understand how 6 people could die in one of the most remote, peaceful-looking places in all of Russia. He made it to the ridge, recorded footage of the mossy hillside where Valentina said it all happened. Nothing unusual. No bones, no rusted gear, just trees, wind, and silence. But on his 3rd night near the ridge, Lobov wrote something unusual in his journal. He described hearing breathing, not animal, not wind, rhythmic, human, slow. It circled his tent twice. He unzipped the flap. Nothing. He said he felt watched, not paranoid, but observed, like a lab rat behind one-way glass. He moved camps the next day. Then silence in the journal. No further entries. Lobov returned safely, but he never published the footage. In a rare interview 3 years later, he said, "I found what I was looking for. That's enough." When asked what he meant, he simply replied, "We weren't supposed to be there." The interviewer pressed him on whether he believed the hikers were killed by something unnatural. Lobov laughed but didn't answer. But I believe he found the answer. You see, there was a detail in Valentina's story, one often glossed over. In one version of her interview, she described Lyudmila as looking not herself. She said her mentor's voice had changed, that she moved in strange, jerky motions, as if something inside her was breaking down but trying to hold shape, as if she wasn't guiding the group anymore, but being guided herself. It didn't match with the Lyudmila others knew. Experienced, calm, deeply spiritual. Something had taken place in that gap between sunrise and horror. Here's what most people don't know. Months before the trip, Lyudmila Korovina had visited a remote Buddhist temple in Tuva. The monks there were known to offer spiritual advice to travelers and forest guides. She had been there before, seeking blessings before past expeditions. But this time she stayed longer. Locals said she left with more than just prayer beads. They claimed she took something, an object wrapped in cloth, never unwrapped. It may have been a relic, or simply superstition. But for whatever reason, she kept it in her pack during the journey. According to Valentina, it was never far from her side. What it was remains unknown. After the incident, the item was never recovered. If it was there at all, it disappeared with Lyudmila's body. Some say the monks had warned her not to take it, that it wasn't meant to leave the temple. Another layer to an already tangled mystery. In the years following the deaths, many hikers reported vivid dreams after visiting the ridge. Not nightmares, at least, not always. More like transmissions, symbols, sounds that didn't resemble language but felt deeply familiar. A few reported seeing figures, shadows at the edge of campfires. Not animals, not people. Something in between. They'd vanish the moment you tried to look directly, always watching from just outside the light. These stories didn't make it into the guidebooks. But imagine watching a man you've poisoned and shot push himself upright, still trying to walk, as if something beyond sheer survival was dragging him forward. Yusupov later admitted he panicked, bolted from the room, and screamed for help. Rasputin then managed to get into the courtyard, trying to flee into the freezing night. The conspirators scrambled after him, shooting again and again. One bullet struck him in the back, and another reportedly in the head. Only then did he finally collapse in the snow. But even then, no one was entirely convinced he was truly dead. Yusupov, in his frenzy, beat the body repeatedly, as if trying to make sure this nightmare wouldn't rise one more time. But even then, they weren't finished. Prince Felix Yusupov and his co-conspirators dragged Rasputin's corpse into a car, drove out to the little Neva River, tied his body with weights, and heaved him over the railing into a hole cut through the ice. It should have ended there, yet even Rasputin's corpse refused to stay ordinary. When his body was later pulled from the frozen river, doctors claimed they found water in his lungs. That detail implied he had still been alive when they dumped him in. Alive after poison, alive after bullets, alive after brutal beatings. Was it really possible that only the river had finished him off? For those who already suspected Rasputin was more than human, that detail sealed the myth. And if Rasputin's death feels impossible to believe, there's another story that pushes it even further. A man who was poisoned multiple times, struck by a car, left to freeze, and still lived through it all. His name was Mike Malloy, and some swore he was proof that death itself could be cheated. I'll drop the link at the end of this video, so you can decide for yourself who wore the crown of the truly unkillable. But back to Rasputin. This wasn't just an assassination anymore. It had become a gothic tale, complete with failed poisons, impossible endurance, and killers who couldn't seem to finish the job. The man they called the Mad Monk now appeared to be something darker, an indestructible force of nature. Yusupov himself painted him that way in his memoirs, writing as if Rasputin had to be destroyed like a demon rather than killed like a man. If the aim was to erase his influence quietly, the conspirators could not have bungled it worse. Instead of restoring faith in the monarchy, the assassination only highlighted how desperate and divided Russia's nobility had become. Here were princes and dukes, once the pillars of stability, now sneaking around in basements with poison and pistols, terrified of one unshaven peasant from Siberia. To the public, it was proof that the empire was crumbling from within. Talk about Rasputin long enough, and the same theories always come up. Was he a healer or a fraud? A holy man or a heretic? Or was he a spy? People argue on both sides, and the stories have grown over a century. Rasputin accused of being a spy sounds convincing at first glance. It's neat, it's dramatic, and it ties every disaster Russia faced to the one man everyone already feared. But when you start looking closer, the pieces may not always fit as tightly as the rumour mill wanted them to. The Okhrana, Russia's secret police, also believed this and shadowed Rasputin constantly. They listened to gossip, trailed him in the streets, filed endless reports to catch him in the act. But not once did they find him passing coded notes or meeting shadowy contacts. The British watched him too, convinced he must be working for the Kaiser. Their verdict wasn't any different. No proof, just a mountain of suspicion. What really kept the idea alive was his open defiance of the war. Rasputin had warned Nicholas before the first shot was fired that war with Germany would destroy Russia. And after 1914, he wouldn't stop saying it. He begged for peace, urged retreats, and predicted catastrophe. In peacetime, those words might have been brushed off as mystical rambling. In wartime, they sounded treasonous. To the soldiers dying at the front and the family starving at home, he didn't have to pass messages to Berlin to be branded a traitor. Add to that his rough manners, his scandals, his foreign-sounding name, and the fact that he somehow swayed the Empress while standing so far outside the world of nobility. It was the perfect recipe for suspicion. The theory of espionage gave his enemies exactly what they needed: a simple story and a villain they could point to while the empire cracked apart. As for Alexandra herself, her German birth gave the rumours more fuel. It has been said that wartime paranoia doesn't need solid proof, only a hint of betrayal to take root. So when Rasputin sent her endless letters, or was spotted entering the palace at odd hours, some insisted those moments hinted at coded messages and secret reports. There has never been hard evidence of such things, yet once rumour ties itself to war, it clings with remarkable force. The defeats on the battlefield only gave the stories sharper teeth. Catastrophes like the battles at the Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes crushed not just armies, but also public faith. With the losses so vast they defied imagination, blaming simple incompetence seemed inadequate. Treachery gave a more satisfying explanation. And who better to cast as a traitor than a man already whispered about, as a sorcerer, a drunkard, and a corrupter of the throne? Nicholas added to the impression in 1915 when he left Petrograd to command the army himself, leaving Alexandra to handle domestic politics. To many, that meant Rasputin's influence had grown unchecked. Each new military disaster was no longer seen as a failure of generals, but as proof that the empire had fallen into the wrong hands. Some maintain that Rasputin's visions of peace were sincere. He often spoke of violence leading only to ruin, and by many accounts he believed it deeply. But in an atmosphere thick with suspicion, sincerity was irrelevant. Every time he urged the Tsarina to trust negotiation instead of war, it was heard not as prophecy, but as treason. So was he really a spy? Historians today lean toward no. There's no solid proof he ever passed information to the Germans. And just as some are not convinced he was ever involved in espionage, others are just as skeptical of his supposed supernatural powers. To them, the stories of miraculous healing sounded more like coincidence, exaggeration, or wishful thinking than evidence of anything mystical. Tsarevich Alexei's illness was no secret inside the palace walls. Haemophilia turned the smallest bruise into a nightmare, and the Romanovs had already burned through the best doctors Europe could offer. By the time Rasputin stepped in, the family wasn't just desperate, they were drowning. So when the boy improved, it looked like sorcery. The holy man from Siberia had done what science couldn't. At least, that was the story. But some point out that the doctors of the day often reached for aspirin, not knowing it thinned the blood. That only made Alexei worse. They say Rasputin's mistrust of medicine and his refusal to let doctors touch the boy during crises kept aspirin out of his system. To them, that alone probably saved his life. No magic, just a twist of fortune, where stubbornness happened to work in his favour. Others explain it as presence. He didn't pace corridors or wave charms. He sat with Alexei, prayed in a steady voice, and urged calm. For a child in pain, panic only pushed the bleeding further, and Rasputin's stillness seemed to slow the boy's pulse and give his body a chance. To those who doubted the supernatural, it was reassurance, not miracles doing the work. People can argue it was aspirin or nerves or just a coincidence, and maybe they're right. But the way it all kept falling in his favour makes me pause. Rasputin walked into a room, and things shifted. Alexei's breathing slowed, the panic lifted, and suddenly what looked hopeless didn't feel so final. The Romanovs clung to that, and honestly, I get why. A part of me thinks there really was something unexplainable at work. The healing's already made Rasputin sound otherworldly, but his death? That's where rumour turned him into something like a dark legend. You've heard the tale already, but not everyone buys into that version. Prince Felix Yusupov, who led the murder plot, published his own dramatic account where Rasputin seemed unstoppable, soaking up poison and bullets like it was nothing. Many think he shaped the story to glorify himself and make Rasputin look more like a monster than a man, so that the act of him murdering another man might look more noble than cruel. And then there are the medical findings. The autopsy didn't show any trace of poison, and there was no water in his lungs to suggest drowning. What it did reveal was a single close-range gunshot to the forehead, fatal on impact. To those who take the reports literally, all the other details were never real, just layers added to keep the myth alive. Douglas Smith argues that Rasputin was less a man and more a distorted figurehead for everything that terrified Russia's elite. According to him, most of what we think we know, his wild, drunken nights, his supposed demonic powers, even the legendary details of his murder, came straight from his enemies' pens. They weren't writing history, they were writing propaganda designed to stain the monarchy. And you have to admit, they succeeded. The caricature they built of Rasputin as an evil puppet master is the very image that stuck for more than a century. Joseph Fuhrman went even deeper, tearing apart the very sources themselves. He dug through court testimonies, police files, gossip-filled memoirs and sensationalist press reports, only to find contradiction after contradiction. Practically every witness had a reason to despise Rasputin, which means the so-called evidence against him is a minefield of bias. Take the stories of him hypnotizing the Tsarina or shaping government policy from the shadows. Fuhrman traced those to nothing more than rumors cooked up to scapegoat Rasputin for Russia's wartime disasters. In his view, Rasputin definitely influenced the royal family, especially when it came to their son's health. But the darker legends belong more to fantasy than fact. And yet here's where I hesitate. When every scrap of evidence is poisoned by bias, does that make Rasputin less dangerous or more untouchable, hiding in plain sight behind the very fog his enemies created? So yes, the scholars can shake their heads and mark their papers with red ink, saying Rasputin's story was just smoke and mirrors. But when I look at the timing of his rise, the sheer chaos around his presence, and the way enemies from every corner wanted him gone, it's hard not to feel like he was playing a deeper game. If he wasn't the spy they whispered about, then why did his shadow stretch across both Russian and foreign plots like it did? I mean, let's be honest, myths don't bring down monarchies on their own. Someone had to be pulling threads in ways that unsettled the strongest people in the empire, and that someone just happened to be a peasant mystic from Siberia who walked straight into the royal court and refused to leave, no matter how many assassination attempts came his way. That's not just a story, that's someone who knew too much and lived too dangerously. Maybe the historians are right to tell us not to believe every rumour. Fair enough, But the strangest part is how even their careful dismantling still leaves Rasputin standing in the middle of history like an unanswered riddle. Call him a fraud, call him a scapegoat, call him whatever you like. I still think he was more dangerous than anyone could imagine. And since we've been talking about men who seemed impossible to kill, don't forget the story I mentioned earlier, the one about Mike Malloy, the man who survived everything his enemies threw at him. I've left the link right here at the end of this video. You're not going to want to miss it. Going to want to miss it. Going to want to miss it.